It is my great honor at this point to introduce to you our next speaker, our next professor, Dr. Michael Griffith, who is the University of Wyoming Director of Orchestral Activities and the conductor of the UW Symphony Orchestra, a position he's held for 26 years. Dr. Griffith is an accomplished oboe player, but he's decided to devote himself to orchestral leadership, where he has been widely recognized for the breadth of his programming, which in a single season can range from early Baroque to world premieres of new music, which he's done more than 20 times. At the University of Wyoming, he's often been recognized for his teaching excellence, and he is an excellent teacher. And that expertise has often resulted in visiting professorships at other universities, Shanghai University, for example, and the Sibelius Academy in Helsinki, Finland. Dr. Griffith also taught in the University of Wyoming London semester. He's been a guest conductor of the Orchestra Petrobras Pro Musica of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, and of Denver's Mercury Ensemble, as well as the Cheyenne Symphony and Opera Fort Collins. He's conducted concerts in Toronto and London, in Canada, as well as New York City's Times Square.
To be fair, that's London, Ontario.
Okay. Canada was randomly in there in that list of words. In 2007, he led the UW Orchestra on a week-long tour of Bolivia, and he's conducted concerts with soloists ranging from the harpsichordist Igor Kipnik to the violinist Benny Kim. I need to tell you, however, that soundtracks for Wyoming Public TV's Wyoming Voices won a Gold Aurora Award, and Dr. Griffith regularly shares his conducting expertise with younger musicians in all-state orchestras and in other ensembles from the Atlantic coast to the Rockies, as well as in China and in Canada. Today, Dr. Griffith will speak to all of us about From the Mysterious to the Mundane, how conductors make music. And you just got a 2-second hint of that. So, Dr. Michael Griffith.
Thank you, Maggie. I'd like to start with perhaps the best example of orchestral conducting that you will ever see. Leonard Bernstein conducting the Vienna Philharmonic in the finale to the Haydn Symphony No. 88. And yes, he was conducting. The Haydn Symphony No. 88 starts and the tempo does not change from the beginning to the end. It's for a relatively small orchestra that can hear each other very well. And so what did Bernstein do? With his face, the players could see a little bit about the mood of the music, and then he stayed out of their way. Now, it's the Vienna Philharmonic, arguably the world's greatest orchestra, certainly one of the 10 great of the world. They don't need somebody doing this all the way through the finale to a simple little piece of music. Does that mean conductors are unnecessary? Oh, far from it. This is simply one extreme of what is necessary for a conductor. I didn't want to take you too far into it, but Bernstein literally at one point turns to a flute player just before an entrance and goes, so what do we need it for? So I would like to ask you to do something. There's what, about 80 people in the room, I'll guess. Would you all say the word now and say it perfectly together? Now. Actually, that was pretty darn good. Let's see if we can get it even better together. Okay, Doc? Now. So, there's always an upbeat and a downbeat. The upbeat says, take your breath, be ready, and let's do it one more time. Now. And I'm going to have you do it differently. I'm not going to say anything. So I do have a good scholarship fund for the University Orchestra. Now, I'm going to do it the same volume, but yet somewhat differently each time. I want you to say the word now twice. Can you get the second one together? Ah, that was a little trickier, wasn't it? And you got it. So, the obvious things that a conductor does are so obvious that all of you, and I suspect some of you played in your high school band or orchestra, some of you sing in church choirs, a few of you may participate in the amateur orchestras or the amateur bands here, but a lot of you have never followed a conductor before in your life, and yet you've figured it out. So at that level, what a conductor does is very obvious. Right now, I'm preparing the University Orchestra in the Dvorak Symphony No. 4. One of the tunes in the last movement is a very simple little bum 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 ba-dim bum 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 ba-dum bum bum bum. So there are three notes that are the same pitch, same length. If I were to conduct it like this, bum 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 ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum, they would play it exactly as I just sang it. That's a little tiring on the arm for a 10-minute piece of music. So I might choose at some point to drop into only conducting every other beat, so it would look like this. Yum bum bum ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum. In which case they would play it like this. Bum 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 ba-dum bum 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 ba-dum. You notice I was emphasizing those notes where I actually did give a downbeat, and not so much emphasis where I was just traveling up. And they don't think about it. They don't say to themselves, oh, he's giving more emphasis on certain notes than other notes. It's much more intuitive than that. They're not staring at me. They're staring at their music. They're seeing me out of their peripheral vision. And yet, if I were to shift to this beat, within a few measures, they would definitely have changed the style. So that is getting a little bit more to the nitty-gritty of what a conductor does that is a little less obvious. And of course, setting the tempo. What you didn't see at the beginning of this video, because of the little mess up when the video went off the screen while Maggie was talking, was Bernstein did do this at the beginning. He got them started. Only then did he go back to this pose. And it's not just what the conductor does with the arms. I'd like you to say the word now, and I'm going to have both my hands in my pocket. And yet, I think you can still do it. Little trickier. Now you know what I'm going to do. Let's do it again. So what we do with our breath, what we do with our general body language. When Bernstein turned to that one flutist and kind of went a little, that was saying to the flutist, play this lovingly. And I'm sure he, Vienna Philharmonic at that time was all male, I'm sure he did play it differently than if Bernstein had just done. So one of the tools that we use is our face to emote. And probably the most obvious and the most important part of the face is the eyes and the eyebrow. When I was in graduate school and I was in the orchestra, I got my master's at Michigan State, and we were doing the marvelous Puccini opera Turandot, which has this incredibly huge ending. And I play, as Maggie mentioned, I play the oboe, which uses air. And we got to the last note, and the conductor was holding it for the longest time, and I just felt, I have no more air left in my lungs. I need to stop playing. And then the conductor did this. And I played a crescendo. I got louder. I don't know how. I had no more air left in my lungs, but somehow when he did this before he cut us off, we played that crescendo. We were to the absolute depths of our ability to sustain a note, and all Dennis Burke did was this, and we got louder. Just the tool, just the eyebrows. I'm going to go to my second video. This is Riccardo Muti, and this is the overture to La Forza del Destino of Verdi, which is a piece that Muti would know very well because he, in addition to being the music director of the Chicago Symphony, is the music director of the the La Scala Opera House in Milan, Italy. And watch his eyes, if you'd be so kind. Kind of boring, isn't he? Now watch his eyes. One question I always get is, what about the baton? Some people use a long baton, some people use a short baton. It's mostly personal preference. This is Valery Gergiev, who's one of the great Russians conducting today. What does he have in his hand? It's a toothpick. It, honest to God, is a toothpick. So lest you think that that's a very important part, probably the two greatest interpreters of Stravinsky's great ballet, The Rite of Spring, the Sacre du Printemps, are Pierre Boulez, who I got to hear conducted with the Cleveland Orchestra, and who conducts never with a baton at all. Everything is with the hands in a box about this big. The other would be Pierre Monteux, who conducted the world premiere in 1913. I studied at the Monteux School. Monteux had already passed away. I studied with his student, but Monteux conducted with a baton about this long. And both performances of The Rite of Spring are brilliant. It's personal preference, what feels right in the hand, and what conveys what you want. Let me start a little bit after this introductory stuff. Let's talk about history a little bit. Before about 1800, most orchestras used no conductor at all. Orchestras were small, the hall was small, the music was relatively simple. The musicians knew this style of music because they all played music only of that style. And so they didn't need a person up there not making a sound. When they did need something to go together, either the first violinist, the first chair first violinist, pretend this is a violin and this is a bow, instead of bowing here, he might bow a little bit like this. So it's very visible. Or the harpsichord player. Orchestras at that point would have a harpsichord is a predecessor of the piano. The person playing the harpsichord was not playing a written out part, was just playing chords, could play those with one hand, might conduct with his hand at the same time, sometimes a rolled up piece of paper. Around 1800, music transformed itself, and that was with, I'll give you one word, Beethoven. Beethoven's music was far more complex than what had come before, demanded a much larger orchestra. At the same time, public concert halls were becoming more and more popular. Therefore, the hall was bigger, the stage was bigger, the orchestra needed to be bigger to fill the hall with that kind of sound. So then it became, and I'm going to use this term quite intentionally, efficient to have a conductor. It saved time, it made things a little bit more easy to play together. And the first person that we know of who stood in front of an orchestra without actually having an instrument in hand was a German composer and violinist named Ludvig Spore. He'd been concertmaster of the orchestra where this happened and simply got tired of trying to, from his chair, conduct with his bow and simply said, I'm going to stand up. And he found that a violin bow is kind of silly to have when you don't have a violin in hand, and started using a small piece of wood, and hence we have conducting with a baton. Not all orchestras used that technique. Some resented it. They felt, why are we having somebody who's not playing telling us what to do? But as we went through the 19th century, the music got more and more complex. The demands, not so much at the performance, but at the rehearsals, became more interpretive. One of the hallmarks of the 19th century, which we call romanticism in music, was of an individual interpretation. And so having a conductor who could put his personal stamp on the music became paramount, or at least became very important. And so the concept of having a conductor became standardized. I should tell you, however, that the conductor did not look like you're used to. I mean, moving centered. Now, you would be used to, if you're in the audience, you would see this of the conductor, right? They would never do that back then. They would either conduct standing sideways to the orchestra or literally conduct while facing the audience. And the reason for that is very simple. There would be royalty in the audience frequently because royalty is what paid for many concerts, and you, of course, never turned your back on royalty. And so even as conductors began to conduct, it wouldn't be what you would expect. There are some orchestras that still do not use a conductor. Probably the most famous in our country is the Orpheus Chamber Orchestra in New York City. And their reason to be special among all the great orchestras in New York is that they always perform without a conductor. And, here's that word again, it's inefficient. It takes them far more hours of rehearsal time to put a piece of music together. Their performances are very precise. They've worked it all out. But at rehearsal, One player says, oh, no, no, the opening of Beethoven's Fifth, I really believe it should be da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da. And maybe the first cellist says, oh, no, 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 it's got to be da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da, because Bernstein doesn't tell us. Beethoven never told us. He just put the notes down on the page. And these are equally fine musicians. They simply have a different idea. Our music notation is inaccurate, or perhaps I should say it's incomplete. It tells us what notes to play, and in a general sense it tells us what tempo. But it is up to somebody to make a decision exactly how fast, exactly how slow, exactly how long, exactly how short. And in Orpheus, it's an orchestra of 30 players, and there's probably 40 opinions. So it takes them longer, and of course these are union musicians. More rehearsals means they need more funding to make it work. Also, and now we're getting to my personal opinion, I do find their recordings a little bit on the bland side. Why would that be? Because if you have a divergence opinion, what generally tends to happen is that eventually opinion coagulates into the center. So that outlier who has the brilliant idea that's a little bit outlandish at one moment will be voted down. And so their performances, again, this is just my personal opinion, are very accurate, beautifully played, but not so interesting as to bring forth a new idea in a piece of music that I might have heard a dozen times before. I do want to tell you about one orchestra well before the time of Ludvig Spore that did have a conductor, and his unfortunate demise. And some of you are nodding, oh, they know this story. At the court of Louis XIV in Paris, or at Versailles, the origins of ballet, as we know it as a performing art form, were growing. Louis XIV loved the ballet, and there was a gentleman named Jean-Baptiste Luli who had a multitude of duties. He was the ballet master, as in he taught the ballet, the dancers, the dances. He composed the music, and he led the orchestra. And because this was a relatively new art form, sometimes the dancers had a problem hearing the pulse. So he had a long staff, not a conductor's baton, but a staff that if the tip was on the ground, the top would be here. And he would gently tap the ground with the bottom of his baton so that the players, the dancers, and I guess the players as well, would hear the pulse. Unfortunately, Luli also had a bit of a temper. And at one point was angry, I don't know at whom, and slammed his baton, his staff down very hard and hit himself in the foot. He died of gangrene some weeks later. Perhaps in a less dramatic sense, but even in Mozart's time, this was also before conductors, Mozart was playing harpsichord, and the orchestra was not playing quite as well together as he wanted, and Mozart started tapping his foot. And the orchestra still wasn't together, and he started pounding his foot down, and the buckle flew off of his shoe and slid all the way across the room. We know about this because Mozart wrote about the experience in a letter to his father, which luckily his letters to his father have been preserved. It's not clear from the letter whether this was a rehearsal or was this an actual performance. I mean, nowadays, of course, we would never, ever assume that a conductor would do anything audible, except every once in a while we hear the conductor breathe. And George Szell used to hum along a little. And you hear that on recordings. But to pound your foot during a performance, unheard of. Pound your foot enough that your shoe buckle flies across the room. It was different. Let me now go back to this issue of choices. As I said, musical notation is incomplete. The reason that you go to your brilliant concerts here in the summer with the Teton Festival Orchestra, even if you have a recording of the same piece, is that you want to hear what might be different. Because composers, when they write a piece of music, some exercise great control. They may indicate a metronome number. The metronome is this musical device. It goes click, click, click. You listen to it in rehearsals. There's a certain numeric value. If it's 60, that's 1 beats per second. If it's 120, it's 2 beats per second, and so on. Not every composer used a metronome. It was only invented about 1810, so everybody before that didn't have it. And even composers after that didn't always use it. A perfect example would be Johannes Brahms, who, when asked why he didn't use metronome markings, said the only way I could find the right metronome is every morning I would wake up and play a piece of music and write down, then I would check on the metronome what tempo I'd played it. And I would do this for a year. And at the end of the year, I'd average all these values out, and that would be the metronome marking. Because Brahms understood that one day you might be in a somewhat different frame of mind, and your interpretation of the piece is just slightly different. Now, Brahms is the perfect example of this position, because even in his Italian instructions, musicians always write in Italian, or almost always write in Italian, and there are certain terms that are commonly used to indicate tempo. So in one of his symphonies, Brahms writes, Allegro con brio, ma non troppo, which means fast with life, but not too much. So how am I, as a conductor, to look at that and know exactly what he meant? Well, I don't know exactly what he meant. I have the right to make a decision. I have the duty to make a decision. Okay, so I grew up in a musical household. My father loved Bruckner and Mahler, so I heard a lot of Bruckner and Mahler when I was growing up. I grew up in Cleveland, so I was hearing the Cleveland Orchestra a lot. Cleveland Orchestra was known to sound like a 101-piece string quartet, so great precision was part of what I heard. My most important conducting teacher was a man at the Montessori School named Charles Bruck, who was born in Hungary and had somewhat of the temper and the passion of a Hungarian, but he lived in Paris. So he also had a conception, the Parisian view of music, which has a certain elegance, a certain domination of the melody over the accompaniment. All of these things were part of what informed my musical choices. And then I bring that to when Brahms writes Allegro ma non troppo, I make a choice. And it is my job to make a choice. There's a story about a conductor, I believe this was in London, who went into the rehearsal and said to the players, this must sound like a beautiful sunrise. And he starts conducting, and the player says, no. It's a sunrise on a misty day, and you can see the sun, but it's through the trees, and then suddenly the sun emerges from the trees. And he conducts again, and it's not what he wants. And finally, and he goes into an even more poetic explanation, and a player raises his hand and says, Maestro, I play long, I play short, I play loud, I play fast. What do you want? And yet, I know from my work rehearsing with orchestras that sometimes poetic imagery gives you a different result than technical specifications. And then sometimes it doesn't work. With the same orchestra, just on a different day. Because they are in different frames of mind. And the music may be more or less familiar to them. All of this goes into what happens with a conductor. And then there is the issue of, is it incumbent upon a conductor to follow exactly what the composer wrote? Or are you actually allowed to violate that to an extent to put your own personal stamp on the piece? And this is actually a philosophical argument that conductors will get into. If you ever wonder what conductors talk about, sometimes it's, yeah, where should we go for beer afterwards? But frequently it might be, well, no, but Mozart, why did you put a retard there? Mozart didn't write a retard there. And the other conductor might say, yeah, but the tension level is growing. And by doing a little bit of retard at that moment, that actually increases the tension, because then the resolution of that moment has been delayed just slightly, so the audience, instead of going, goes, So conductors then talk in sexual metaphors a lot. There's a recording of the Tchaikovsky Symphony No. 4, piece I know very well. I just conducted in Montana a couple of weeks ago. And the last movement, it's typical Tchaikovsky. It's fast, it's furious, it's loud, it's exciting, and about a minute before the end, it's going and there's nothing in the score that says you should slow down. It's basically fly to the end and get the standing ovation. There's a recording conducted by Leopold Tchaikovsky. I believe it's the Philadelphia Orchestra. And even though there's absolutely nothing written at that point about a retard, here's what Tchaikovsky does. And I listen to that recording and I say, why is he doing that? Tchaikovsky didn't write that. You owe it to Tchaikovsky to... Gee, that's kind of exciting, isn't it? And then I listen to the end of the recording and I go take a shower. Would I ever do that? No. I feel that that much of a distortion of what the composer wrote is beyond what it is my prerogative to do. But Tchaikovsky had such force of will that his orchestra responded in a way that it sounded perfect. If I did it, it wouldn't sound perfect because it came from my thinking I should do a retard here like Tchaikovsky did, rather than truly feeling that retardando there. So now we are getting into why, when I was growing up in Cleveland, the Cleveland Orchestra under George Szell had a very specific, tight sound, and yet the Philadelphia Orchestra under Ormandy at the same time had a lovely, luxurious sound. And when Ormandy came to Cleveland to guest conduct, by the end of the first rehearsal, Cleveland sounded like Philly normally sounded. And when Szell went to Philly, the Philly would sound clean and tight because that's what Szell demanded. Would Philly sound as clean as Cleveland under Szell? No, because Cleveland did it every week, unless they were demanded to do otherwise. And some of the players didn't like what Ormandy wanted because they were used to the other. And the same thing would happen the opposite. So why do we have, if you go to Amazon, 100 different recordings of Beethoven Symphony No. 5 that are actually different? This is why. Because now we are getting to the essence of what a conductor does. Through our training, through our background, through our own intuition, through our likes and desires, through the mood we are in at that moment, even my performances at the University of Wyoming, which I think are very good, but obviously not at the level of the Cleveland Orchestra or the Philadelphia Orchestra, yet I get people come up to me after the concert and they say, I have this great CD of the New York Philharmonic doing it, and you did so much better. And I smile and I thank them. And I know that on a technical sense, they cannot possibly be correct. As good as my student orchestra is, it obviously is not the New York Philharmonic. But what the audience perceived at that instant in time, because they were engaged visually watching the players, because they were receptive to what we were going to do, they had a different experience than sitting at home listening to their CD of the New York Philharmonic. And now that we can do all this brain mapping, you know, that you put a net over the head and they can tell what parts of the brain are firing it when people are experiencing different things, we have learned that somebody attending a concert, far more of the brain is firing than if they're just listening to a CD of the same piece of music, because different sensory inputs, they're responding to additional sensory inputs. In addition to all of this, now it sounds like all I'm saying is a conductor can do whatever he or she wants. Well, no, because we are tied to historical authenticity to an extent. And I'm going to give you an example of that has nothing to do with classical music. All of those of you that are in my generation know a Glenn Miller tune called In the Mood. Right, that's the tune. Do you know that's not what's written? Here's what's written. Just straight notes. But players who play in big bands doing music at the 40s and 50s know that if the straight eighth notes are written, what you play are what are called swing eighth notes. You distort the rhythm. You actually play something different from what is printed because you know that do-do-dee is easier to write, just literally write on the page, than putting a dotted eighth and a 16th and a dotted eighth and a 16th. So it was a form of musical shorthand that the composer assumed that the players would know to do. And so I changed the rhythm. Do-do-dee, do-do-dee, do-do-dee. I play oboe, but I also play saxophone, so I've done this. I changed the rhythm, and then with my breath, I do little inflections. It becomes do-do-dee, 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 And now it sounds sort of like what the Glenn Miller Band sounded like, and that's my goal. And if I'm conducting with now back to classical music, and I conduct a work from the time of Bach or Handel, it's a kind of music called a French overture. And the notation at the beginning of a French overture always has long note followed by short note, long followed by short, usually a dotted quarter followed by an eighth. So that it would sound, if you play exactly as printed, da, 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 da. That's the overture to Handel's Messiah, I think, I hope. And I would be playing it wrong. Because back then, when they wrote, only in the opening of a French overture, when they wrote a dotted quarter followed by an eighth, what they meant was you play the first note significantly long and the short note very short and delay it until just before the next long note. So it should sound bum, ba-bum, 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 ba-da-dum. It's called double dotting or over dotting. And this is what we call performance practice. How do we know this? Because obviously we have no recordings from this time. But people wrote in treatises how to approach certain pieces of music. And by having studied these treatises, now at least we think we know what it was supposed to have sounded like. And then by giving the string players instructions not to play da, 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 this is a violin, this is a violin bow. Don't go da, 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 but instead they go down, lift, go all the way back to the other end of the bow, do a short up bow, da-da, da-da. By forcing them to do what we call a retake, there's obviously an enforced silence because they're not going to make any sound while they're lifting the bow and putting it down. Dum, da-dum is very different from da, 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 dum. You will hear some recordings done that stretched out way, and the conductor will say, well, that's what is printed in the score. But yes, if you have studied the history, if you studied the treatises from the time, you know that there are certain kinds of musical notation where to be authentic, you must not play what's in the score. And then we get to the whole issue of we think we know what the composer wanted. And then we get to the issue, well, what would the composer have wanted if? And here again, we're getting to decisions conductors need to make. In the Beethoven Symphony No. 5, between the pa-pa-pa-pa, before the ba-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, between that music and the second theme, da-dee-da-da-dee-da-da-dum, there's a very short transition passage which comes about a minute and a half in, and it's by the French horns, da-da-da-da-da-da. Some of you are nodding, you recognize it. It's very bold, exciting, played by the French horns. French horns at Beethoven's time did not have valves. They could only change notes through the use of their lips, which meant, if you know anything about acoustics, they could only play the notes of the overtone series. When that same passage comes back later in the piece, it's in a different key, and the French horns cannot play those notes. Or at least they can only play them by stuffing their hand in the bell to change the pitch, and then it's a very buzzy sound. So Beethoven, the second time around, instead of having the French horns play it, asks the bassoons to play it. Bassoon is a beautiful instrument. It can be lyrical, it can be light, it can be comical. The opening of Sorcerer's Apprentice that Maggie alluded to, bum, ba, bum, beep, ba, 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 bum, ba, bum, is bassoons. It's many things, but the bassoon is not grand and dramatic. Now French horns have valves. So in any key, French horns can play ba 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 bum 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 da 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 da. Any set of notes they could play them. So we have a choice. We could logically say Beethoven clearly wanted it in French horns because that's who he gives it to first. And knowing this piece of history, that French horns at Beethoven's time could not have played the notes the second time around because it's in a different key, only for that reason did he give it to bassoons, and therefore I'm going to tell the French horns to play it the second time and write it into their parts so they know. So what I have done is I have gone into Beethoven's mind and said, if he had had those French horns, that's what he would have wanted. That is a slippery slope, isn't it? Because I could also say, on the other hand, had Beethoven ever heard electric guitars, he might have liked... You know, those of you that have seen the movie Amadeus might agree with me if I say, if Mozart were alive today, he'd be a rock guitarist. So, I mean, that's a facetious going to the extreme, but in that very simple question, do you use, in the recapitulation of the first movement of the Beethoven Symphony No. 5, do you use French horns or do you use bassoons? On the one hand, you do get the wonderfully grand sound if you use horns both times, but you are changing Beethoven, and by God, I change Beethoven with great trepidation. But I do change that moment to French horns, because when the bassoons play it, even if I take every bassoon in the school and play it, it sounds anticlimactic to me. This is a decision a conductor makes. And you know, the players are happy either way. They just want to be told what to do. Bassoons don't play, horns, you got a cue in your part, play it. Bam, end of discussion. The horns know there's a choice to be made there. The bassoons know there's a choice to be made there. My conducting teacher, who loved to straddle the fence, would have said, have the horns play it, but have the bassoons play along. Well, I tell you something, when the horns play it, you don't hear the bassoons anyway. So it makes the bassoons feel better, but, you know, that's all. This is not an issue that all happens when you study a score. When you are a conductor, you get to choose the music. Hey, cool. I got 4 concerts with UW Symphony next year. I get to choose what I want to conduct. I'd love to conduct this, and I'd love to conduct that, and great, we have a season, music I'd like to conduct. And it wouldn't hang together in the slightest any more than if a museum hung a wonderful Picasso right next to a wonderful Michelangelo. That would not make a very attractive wall, would it? Even if you love both Michelangelo and Picasso, that would be an odd wall. How many of you know that kind of salad that Garrison Keillor refers to? It's made with Jell-O and marshmallows and ground up fruit, yeah. And you know, it's okay, right? And you have it with meatloaf and a lot of ketchup and maybe canned green beans. Yeah, right? Yeah. Come on, you've all been there, admit it. They don't serve it at the Red Lion, but you had it. And you probably enjoyed it. You would never serve that with coq au vin, would you? It wouldn't work. And I would never do Beethoven's Fifth and Gershwin's An American in Paris on the same concert. I love Beethoven's Fifth. I love An American in Paris. But they are so utterly devoid of any unifying characteristic that it wouldn't make sense to do them on the same concert. Let me give you a couple of examples of how it might help an audience to enjoy the entire concert and at the end of the evening have a sense of satisfaction. I did a concert a couple of years ago. Let me backtrack. We have a wonderful organ in the concert hall at the University of Wyoming. And I had been urged to do something other than Christmas music that uses the organ with the orchestra. So I talked to our faculty organist, and I said, next year, can we do the Symphony No. 3? It is this great organ part with the orchestra. He was excited to do it, and I said, let's do that. And then I started thinking, well, what do I do with that? Okay, so we have the first half of a concert, and then all of a sudden, orchestra and organ. That might be a little startling to the audience. And it's a beautiful, big, romantic piece, which means it's a certain kind of organ writing. And I thought, that's not the best way to approach this. I have an opportunity here. There's a wonderful little piece attributed to an Italian Baroque composer named Albinoni that uses a very small organ sound just with strings. I thought, well, why don't we start just with that? The poor camera operator is having to stand and move because I'm a wanderer as I go. But you're standing, so I'm going to wander more. It's this wonderful little tiny piece of music, about 5 minutes long, just strings and a very light, elegant organ sound. I thought that's the way to get the audience starting to hear, oh, organ not just at church, organ with classical strings. How interesting. So that was, okay, we'll do that, but it's only 5 minutes long, but then we've introduced organ. I still have, 20 minutes or so left of the first half. And then I had one of these ideas that I went, do I really want to do that? Yeah. I have those kind of ideas a lot. Those of you that know the film Fantasia know a piece by Bach called the Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Ba-da-dum, beedle-da-da-dum, beedle-deem, bum, beam, bum, bum. Great, powerful piece of music, which Bach wrote for the organ. And then Leopold Tchaikovsky, the gentleman who I mentioned as a conductor, he wrote a new version of that, all the same notes, all the same rhythms, all the same harmonies, but written for orchestra instead of for organ, and for a massive orchestra. So I asked our organist, would you play the organ solo version of the D minor toccata for the audience? And he said, what about the orchestra? I said, they're going to sit and listen and they're going to enjoy it. And he played it, and the audience applauded. And then I stood up and I conducted the orchestral version so that the audience could hear exact same piece of music, but one just in the organ and one with the orchestra. Then was intermission, and then when we came back and heard the Saint-Saëns organ symphony, it gave the audience a vastly different view of what the organ and the orchestra could be like without one word of lecture. So I think that was interesting concert programming, and is the kind of thing that a conductor does to say, when you leave this concert, I hope that you feel that you've experienced 4 completely separate pieces of music, but one artistic creation. That's the idea. It may not be, that's a very obvious version. Let me give you a few other examples. Next year, I'm going to do the Gershwin, you know Gershwin's magnificent opera, Porgy and Bess. We could never do that at University of Wyoming, but there is a 40-minute suite, chorus, orchestra, and 2 vocal soloists. And if I can raise, this is another side of a conductor's job, is fundraising. If I can do just a little bit of fundraising to hire an Afro-American soprano and Afro-American baritone, I can do this 40-minute suite from Porgy and Bess, bring it to Laramie. I think that will be great. Contributions will be happily accepted. What do I do with that? Well, what is Porgy and Bess about? It's about the black experience in Charleston, South Carolina in the 1920s, which means it's about being in a segment of society that is different from other segments of society. It's about a person, Porgy, very poor, he's, in his own word, crippled, falls in love with Bess, a very beautiful, elegant woman of somewhat questionable morality. So it's about reaching to different parts of society. So how can I find pieces of music that might fit that mode, even if the music is very different? So we are going to open with the overture to Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story. Bernstein and Copland sound very different. They're both American, they're both 20th century, but they're very different. But you all know the story of West Side Story. It's that kind of, 2 segments of society and life or death. And I'm going to do Aaron Copland's music, Aaron Copland, American, 20th century, the music that he wrote for our town. Again, about a society and about individuals trying to find their place in that society. I'm not going to say much to the audience. I'm not going to stand there with a microphone and point all of this out. I might mention it, yeah, here's what I was thinking about. But we have now different composers coming from a same emotional storytelling idea with their own musical ideas about it. And I think, again, at the end of the evening, the audience will have something to think about, or at least something to mull about subconsciously that might tie the evening together. And that's another thing that's very important for a conductor to do. And you know, not just for an evening, but an entire year. Now, I do 4 concerts at UW. They're students. It takes 4 or 5 weeks to prepare a concert. Your orchestra here at the Teton Festival, these are professionals. It takes less time. They do a concert every week. And the Cleveland Orchestra does a concert every week for 30, 40 weeks. Obviously, you can't find a thread that fits all the way through an entire season, but they might do, by the end of the season, have played all 9 Beethoven symphonies, or the overture to all of Verdi's operas. Or they might, over the course of the season, do 8 different works that feature a certain section of the orchestra. Or they might, over the course of a season, truly try to bring music forth that was written towards the end of World War I or just after the end of World War I, and how did different composers respond to this? so that over the course of that year, some kind of thread ties things together. Just a few examples that I've done at UW. In our 1999-2000 season, which was the end of that century, each concert had one very important work that was written in the 20th century. We did Stravinsky's Firebird Ballet, another concert we did Tchaikovsky Symphony No. 9. You get the idea. So that the last season at the end of the 20th century brought us different kinds of music that were important in the 20th century. The next year, which was our first season in the new millennium, I did a big fundraising campaign to hire composers to write a piece of music for us. So each concert in that season had a world premiere, which we called Premieres for the Millennium. The idea being, we're starting a new millennium, let's have lots of new music. I told you next year I'm going to do Porgy and Bess, which is about society and one's place in society. I'm going to extend that over the course of the year. I don't know for sure, but we are probably going to do the Shostakovich Symphony No. 5, which he wrote just after Stalin had said to Shostakovich, I hate that piece you just wrote. Well, when Stalin says, I hate something you just wrote, you're in fear for your life, aren't you? I mean, literally, he could have been hauled off one night and that would have been the end of it. So he wrote the Symphony No. 5 as an answer to make Stalin like him again. Again, life or death. I may do Strauss's Death and Transfiguration, which is a musical depiction of a man literally battling death, dying, and his soul ascending. I may do the Franck Symphony in D minor, which starts with a little musical motive that is a quote from a very early Beethoven, one of the Beethoven late string quartets. Beethoven over the notes wrote, muss es sein, es muss sein. Must it be? It must be. What did Beethoven exactly mean by that? Well, it certainly sounds like an existential question, doesn't it? So these little threads could be what ties the season together. I would like you to just say 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1. Would you? No. I'll conduct it. I'm in charge, people.
1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1.
So I was thinking I want a crescendo. How about this way?
1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Did I look silly? Maybe. Did you respond? You certainly did. Again, this is sort of two different schools of thought. The great German composer Richard Strauss was also a conductor, and his notes about conducting that have been preserved and published, one of them is, the conductor must never perspire. And he would have conducted like this. But he was working with orchestras like the Vienna Philharmonic, and they would have played it the way the notes were supposed to sound. Anyway, there's actually a great moment of him conducting and taking a watch out of his pocket and looking at while conducting. It's the ability of a conductor to bear his or her soul that puts the real stamp. I used to get audience members who would come up to me and say, I love watching you conduct. And you know, that annoyed me. I thought, but did you like the music? Did you like what you heard? And finally, I responded to somebody that way. And they said, you know, we don't know what to listen for. And when we watch you and you look at the horns, we listen for the horns. And when you look at the orchestra and are angry, we understand that the music is supposed to be angry at that moment, and we listen to it in that frame of mind. And once I understood that, it didn't bother me so much. You must understand that I grew up in the culture that you grew up in, which says, don't cry out loud, da-da-da-da. You all know that pop song. Or I had a conducting teacher who said to me, Mr. Griffith, never conduct for the white-haired ladies in the front row of the box seats. But if I'm being demonstrative, not for the audience, but so that the orchestra responds in a certain way, then the sound will be different, and the audience will perceive what I hope. Now, this, I hope, has been fascinating to you, but what you really want to know is how do conductors show emotion? Because that's what excites you, right? You watch certain conductors, you can tell they're exciting up on the podiums. There's a young Venezuelan conductor named Dudamel. He's now conducting the Los Angeles Philharmonic. He's got this great head of hair. If you want to see emotional conducting, it's all pow. This was a performance in front of the Pope. If you were the most jaded of musicians, even if you play concerts your whole life and you're tired of young upstart conductors, you can't help but be persuaded, inspired, whatever word you want, to play in a certain specific, exciting manner under a conductor like that. That's what we do.